Welcome to Stromness Museum's virtual exhibition opening for 2021. The exhibition this year is Distant Shores, Orkney to Oceania, and part of that exhibition is a special exhibit that we will be revealing to you this evening. They are two Malagan sculptures that come from the New Ireland province in Papua New Guinea. They were sent home to Orkney by Captain John Muir of North Ronaldsay. They have been in storage for quite some time at the Orkney Museum, and a joint project last year saw their conservation, which has enabled them to go on show at Stromness Museum. So, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, Howard Morphy, who is talking to us this evening from Australia.
Hello, I'm Howard Morphy. I'm an anthropologist and somebody who's spent his life working in museums and really writing about art, in particular the indigenous arts. And I've worked at very many different museums, including the British Museum, and of course the museum, one of the museums that I really love is the museum in Stromness. And in some ways, I wish I was there with you now in front of the newly installed Malagan. But I suppose second best, I'm sitting beside a painting, a screen by Stanley Cursiter. I'm being filmed by Frances Morphy, who is a granddaughter of Stanley Cursiter, who indeed I was fortunate enough to meet. And this screen is one that was in his living room in Edinburgh, in Royal Circus, that separated his studio from, if you like, the sort of drawing room area. It was painted round about 1924, 25, 26, exactly the same time that John Muir, a man from North Ronaldsay, sent the Malagan home to Kirkwall. There are lots of things about this painting of Stanley's that are relevant to the history of Orcadians in the world. It certainly has a view of Orcadians as seafarers, the connection to the Vikings. We have Viking ships at the top. But we also have, almost just beside me, something that I believe, in fact, is a representation by Stanley of a Polynesian or Pacific icon, probably in the shape of a woman. This will become very relevant later on. But first of all, about Malagans and about this particular Malagan. So the Malagan refers to a ceremony, a mortuary ceremony in New Ireland, which is an island off the north coast of what is now Papua New Guinea. And the Malagan ceremony is a ceremony that is performed to commemorate a person who has died. It's a ceremony that takes place over several days, sometimes several months. And at the conclusion of the ceremony, there is a great performance in which a series of sculptures, carvings, are revealed. And those carvings are the carvings that we here are called Malagan carvings. The carvings have been commissioned beforehand, and they are really the finale of the whole event. In fact, they've been organised as a series of sculptures. Behind the screen, a huge screen made of different kinds of vegetable materials and woven mats and things like that. And people have not seen the carvings until this moment. And then suddenly the screen is dropped, it's pulled down, and the carvings are revealed in all of their glory. And it's a kind of stage in which people perform, people sing, people dance. The carvings themselves are in a sense put back into life. Now, this particular carving arrived towards the end of one of the sort of great periods of production of malagans. In the end of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, New Ireland was one of the great centres of art production in the world. Some at least 20,000 objects from New Ireland ended up in Europe in that particular period of time. How did this happen? Well, I mean, one of the reasons it happened was that, in fact, the New Ireland people had always been involved in a process of making art for commission. In the case of the malagan ceremonies, people commissioned artists, craftsmen, to produce the set of images that were going to be displayed there. And sometimes images were produced in other islands of the group and traded across there. So it was an environment in which art was something that was part of systems of exchange. New Ireland came under colonial control, initially through traders who set up sort of relationships, engagement with New Ireland communities, but towards the end of the 19th century it became part of German New Guinea, and at that time copra plantations were established in the area, and the New Irelanders became very involved, obviously as workers in the plantations, but it was actually a time of the explosion of wealth within the community. So there was a fantastic development of the malagan tradition at that time, and in mortuary rituals many malagans were produced for those final ceremonial performances. So what happened to malagans at the end of the ceremony? Well, at the end of ceremonies, the malagans had different kinds of endings to their life. Some of them were taken into the bush and they were decayed naturally, wind, weather, storm. Some were ceremonially burnt, but a large number of them were actually sold as trade items to the traders who were then based in that region. And in some ways that was very much how this large number of wonderful, extraordinary works of art ended up, rather than decaying in the bush or being burnt, traded to a very distant continent of Europe. We don't need to go into the sort of details of the subsequent colonial history here at this particular moment in time, but New Irelanders have carried on their traditional art practices. Malagan ceremonies are still performed, and over that particular long period of time there have been tremendous changes in aspects of the form of malagan carvings, but also continuities. Now you can see from the carving in the Stromness Museum that's been restored that these are extraordinarily interesting works. They were works that excited Europeans, first of all as a kind of curiosity, but fundamentally as something that in some ways was one of the ways that the representational artistic systems of Europe were being challenged by the arts that people saw being produced in Oceania, in the Americas, in Africa, outside Europe. Because these are not in the kind of figurative tradition, the sort of realism that Europe was at the end of in some ways, but it was at the moment of modernism. It was the moment when actually artists were beginning to change the direction of European art. And malagans were one of those artistic traditions that influenced and helped not change but be very much in dialogue with the kind of changes that were happening in European as artists. Artists became aware of fundamentally different traditions of art history that existed elsewhere in the world. So what about this Malagan of John Muir's? Well, it was a long time ago that it was produced, and it didn't come with any documentation. John Muir didn't write a story about where he acquired it or anything else. But in general terms, we can say quite a lot about that. We know that when it was initially revealed in a ceremony, it would have been painted brilliantly. And we know it would have had several companions that sat beside it. What about its form? What about its meaning? Well, the Malagan sculptures are part of a ceremony that both commemorates somebody who has died, but also is the process of the transition of that person from life to the spirit world. And the whole sort of structure of Malagans makes it easy to think of how you are actually looking into this person as they move from life into death. You can see through the structure of the body things that suggest body parts, suggest the bones, the backbones, suggest internal organs. So you have a sense of looking inside the figure. When it's painted, the painting is seen as the sort of bright skin of the person. So the very fact that the paint over time fades is something that's perfectly reasonable, that we can no longer see the brilliance that was there first of all in the ceremonial performance, but we can see the really detailed kind of structure. And it would have been connected to the life of spirits in the afterlife, in the forests, in the bush, different kinds of spirits which would have different names linked to the community. We've lost those names in this particular case, but those names are still present in the performances that people hold today. Looking at some of the features of it, at the very base you can see a whole series of beautifully carved little fish that are sort of holding up the sculpture. And those fish are very important in New Ireland cosmology and belief systems, because fish are both the productive, in a sense, a symbol of prolific life, are obviously a resource of food. And they're also something that in New Ireland mythology is connected to myths that are associated with death and with the regeneration of life, with rebirth. I think that's probably a good point to end there. We are dealing with a continuing tradition. We're dealing with a New Ireland where people themselves are in many ways proud that their art has had such an impact on the world, where now in the present people can revisit those collections either online, so they'll be coming to Stromness digitally, but also very much bringing images back home, but still making works of art for the outside world as a statement of the nature and identity of their culture, their traditions, their creativity in the world as it is today.